We're going to be starting this morning out of the book of Galatians. And it seems that I go back to this book a lot. It is one of the foundational books the Apostle Paul wrote to the early church. The Apostle Paul went through I guess you would call it the western regions of Galatia. Galatia would be the part of the country of Turkey now that's kind of the central northern part of that nation. A very important province for the Roman Empire. And established churches there, leaving behind pastors and deacons. And then he moved on and had the Macedonian call and spent a lot of time in Corinth. And then he made it over to Ephesus. And while in Ephesus on his third missionary journey, he wrote this letter. The Galatians had received Christ freely. There were many Christians, many followers, but along came some Judaizers. These were Christians that felt like in order to be a Christian, you had to be a Jew. That meant you had to keep the law, observe the feast, all the holidays, and the most important thing to a Jew was the males had to be circumcised. They had to undergo a surgery, no matter how old they were. And the Apostle Paul is writing this back, and you'll find in the first part of the second chapter, he says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Who is taking you from the openness and the freedom of Christ into being bound by the law?" And so we're going to start reading this morning from Galatians chapter 5, and the title of my presentation this morning is Liberty, and I think you will see why. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." And then chapter 5, verse 13 and 14. "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh or to sin, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And then I want to turn back to Galatians chapter 2 and read verse 16. "Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified." As I told you, Chad Sullivan talked here 2 years ago about the concept of liberty. You know, having been born and raised in the United States of America, I am a born, bred, and raised boy from southern Missouri. I didn't really understand what liberty was. I began to study a little bit the Constitution. I studied a little bit about our founding fathers. I'm going to read some quotes from some of them here to you in just a few minutes. These men that established this nation were radical for liberty. And I mean radical for it. They had lived under the tyranny of the King of England. They had written the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin edited it a little bit. And John Adams told Thomas Jefferson, "I will stand by every word that you have written." Now that Declaration of Independence is not a governing document. It is an establishing document. It is a radical document. And it deals with the concept of being free and having liberty in Christ. I looked up the definition of liberty. And it says in Webster's dictionary, if they haven't changed it, the quality or state of being free, the power to do as one pleases. Now, obviously, there are limitations to that. When I'm driving up and down these roads, for my understanding of esteeming others higher than oneself, I observe the speed limit. It says to drive 55, I try to drive it. I got a little thing on my phone that if I go 5 miles over the speed limit, it beeps me and keeps me in line with esteeming others higher than oneself. I want to read to you a quotation from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's a word a lot of people don't understand, rights. That among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And a very important sentence that few people read. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. Notice, to secure these God-given rights is the responsibility of our government. Not to take them, not to abuse them, not to establish tyranny. Now, the question of power has been addressed by Thomas Jefferson. And there is power in government. One of the first things our government did was put down the Whiskey Rebellion from up in the Northeast and down into Maryland, where people that were making whiskey decided they weren't going to pay the federal tax. And George Washington had to establish, no shots were really fired of any consequence, but the tax was paid. Thomas Jefferson addresses the question of power. The question of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bend him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. I want you to think about that a minute, and all of the things that we have experienced in this COVID pandemic and all of the tyranny that unelected individuals have brought down upon us. There's been a lack of disregard for our governing document, the Constitution. I hear from time to time some politician on the TV or on the radio say, it's a threat to our democracy. But do you know that the word democracy is in none of our governing documents? It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in any of the other amendments that have been added to the Constitution. The word for democracy can only be found in the Federalist Papers, where it is mentioned in a derogatory term. It's endangering our democracy. Have absolutely no understanding of the oath they took to defend our Constitution against enemies both foreign and domestic. Do you know that every person that enters the military, every person that becomes part of the police force, every person that enters any form of government, down to a county seat or a city alderman, takes that oath to defend our Constitution against enemies both foreign and domestic? And I'm unfortunately here to tell you this morning that there are a lot of domestic people that have no understanding of our form of governance. They have no understanding of what liberty really means. They really don't understand anything about the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, our government is not a democracy. A democracy is mob rule by one. All you need to have is 1 over 50%, and you can have anything done you want to do in a nation that has a democracy. You know, there is no democracy on the face of the earth, including where it was tried first in Greece, that has ever survived the test of time. Not one! Not one! You go to Google and see if I'm not right. A constitutional republic is run just like R-CALF is. You elect representatives, you elect senators, and they govern you based on government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That is a constitutional republic, not a democracy. Thank God for it. Now, Daniel Webster said that as he reviewed the Constitution, and after it was presented in its printed form, he made some comments that were very interesting. He said, "I believe that this Constitution is God-inspired, and I believe that there is no set of men in the history of mankind any smarter, any more concerned, any more dedicated to the development of a government that will stand the test of time." Our Supreme Court has finally, in the last few months, established that this government must abide by the Constitution. And not only must it abide by it, but it must interpret it based on what was done to establish it at the time it was written. Not on common law, not on English law, not on law of Europe, not on law of some other nation, but on how this Constitution was written. And we have documents after document after document that define and identify why this nation was set up as a constitutional republic and why the Constitution was written. Do you realize the Constitution was originally ratified without the first 10 amendments? And Patrick Henry, in specific, said, "I will not vote for this Constitution unless these amendments are established." And others said, "Well, these are inferred. They're inferred freedoms. You ever see a freedom that's inferred that ever lasts?" No. 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 Power is what people... I mean, it's amazing. Do you know that power is a greater driver than wealth for people? Is a greater driver than wealth. Power will ruin you. Power is evil. Power is wrong. The power for our constitutional republic is in the hands of the people. If we don't like what our representatives do, we vote them out of office. We don't like what our senators doing, we vote them out of office. We don't like what our president's doing, we vote them out of office. Government by the people, of the people, and for the people. And it has stood the test of time as a constitutional republic. Think about the concept of liberty. Think about what liberty means. Liberty is freedom. And those 13 colonies did not have freedom. In Parliament in England, they were establishing taxes, and they were setting up rules for trade with no participation of the colonists, who viewed themselves as loyal subjects of the king. A tax on paper, a tax on stamps, a tax on tea, a tax on molasses, preventing trade with anyone but England. Eventually they had enough. And they wrote the Declaration of Independence. You know, there was a great battle that took place prior to July the 4th, 1776. And it happened in April in 1775 on the greens of Concord and Lexington. And it was a battle over gun control. The governor of the state of Massachusetts has sent the British troops out to remove all of the arms that the militia had in place to defend themselves in each of those two towns. They accomplished that eventually by robbing the magazine there of powder and lead and throwing the lead in a lake, which was later recovered and utilized by the Continental Army. The first battle, the first shed blood, the first 8 or 9 patriots to die for their country died for the establishment of the right and freedom to bear arms. Don't ever forget that. I have studied quite a few things in preparation for this particular presentation. And I wanted you to know that just recently, I read this statement from Thomas Jefferson. I loved it so much that I put it on the wall. And I want you to know that if you want to listen to a fairly decent Sunday school lesson every week, Brenda and I put one up every week for Sunday on a YouTube channel entitled Robert Thornsberry. If you type in Robert Thornsberry, and they're not too long, 20 to 30 minutes. Sometimes I get a little windy and they go 40. But we discussed the scriptures and have a Sunday school lesson. It was initially established when COVID had decimated this country and they shut the churches down for a period of weeks, and we wanted to be able to communicate with our Sunday school class. And hanging on the wall behind my lectern where I give this Sunday school class is this quote from Thomas Jefferson. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of men. I'm going to tell you, I'm here to establish for you this morning, these men were radical for liberty. The FBI just recently, a memo from the FBI was just recently leaked to the public. And in that memo, the FBI is trying to train their agents on how to identify a potential domestic terrorist, a potential white supremacist, I think is what they really called it. And the list of things were quotes like that, quotes from our founding father that someone might issue or proclaim. But in particular, there were some things they detested. One of them was Betsy Ross's flag of the 13 colonies was used to fight the Revolutionary War. The other was a specific flag, Don't Tread on Me, the Gadsden flag. I fly the Gadsden flag. I fly it at the gate to my house, along with the American flag, and I took my grandkids out there the other evening and lined them all up, and I had them all pledge allegiance to the flag. What's that make me? Because I fly the Gadsden flag at my home, I wear the lapel pin, Don't Tread on Me, am I a domestic terrorist? What has happened to this nation that we have no regard for our founding fathers and what they went through to establish this constitutional republic? What does Don't Tread on Me mean? It means, King England, don't tread on me! That's what it means. It means I'm free. I am removing myself from your governance. I'm establishing a government based on the foundations of the Word and based on liberty and freedom. Well, I didn't come at no cost. We had to fight a war to get that liberty. And I wonder if we have in our population today those that would be willing to stand for liberty and freedom. And so I researched. When you go back and look at the 13 colonies, how many of the people, what was the percent of the population that actually fought for freedom, that were part of the Patriot movement, that were part of this movement that Thomas Jefferson said, we are here to deal with tyranny. We will not accept tyranny. We will not receive tyranny. We do not intend to cooperate with tyranny. We are not going to have tyranny. We're going to have liberty and freedom. So what percent of the population of the 13 colonies do you think went along with that? Well, John Adams said it was a third. A third of the population went along, followed, participated in Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin's movement to remove tyranny from the land. It's interesting when you look at what happened. What about the other 2/3 of the people? Well, the other third of the people, 1/3 of them, the other 2/3, 1/3 of them stayed with the British. They were what was called loyalists. They worked against the Patriots. They fought against them. They had civil war in the South. If you know anything about what happened in South Carolina, if you know anything about Lookout Mountain, if you know anything about the Cowpens, if you know anything about the Battle of Camden, they joined with the British to repress their own relatives, their own friends, their own community, and keep them under the tyranny of the King of England. But there was also another third that did nothing. They did nothing. They stayed back. They didn't join with the Patriot movement, and they didn't join with the Loyalists. They basically wanted to wait and see who won. We'll then go with whoever won. Isn't that interesting? Because I didn't realize that John Adams had made that statement. He'd be someone that would know. He ought to know, hadn't he? A third of the population was willing to stand and fight, put their life on the line to remove tyranny from the land and establish the basic freedoms and liberty that we live with today. A third did not even want liberty, and a third didn't care. I thank God that the Patriots won. I have a few statements I'm going to make. Are we going to have to fight too? I don't mean literally going out in the woods with our firearms. I don't mean it in that regard. We should not have to do that in a constitutional republic. But I can tell you that to maintain our freedom and liberty, we are going to have to fight. We're going to have to stand up for what's right. We can't be in that third that did nothing. We can't be in that third that received tyranny, loss of freedom, lack of movement. Can't be that. Can't be that. It's not possible. It's not in my DNA. Not in my DNA. Let me tell you what I put down. We must fight to end control of our markets. We must fight for fair price discovery. We must fight to end monopolistic practices that rob us all of a fair return for the fruit of our labor. We must fight to reinstate mandatory country of origin labeling. We must fight for consumers' right to choose the safest and most wholesome meat in the entire world. And I don't say that flippantly. I've been around the entire world. I've encircled the globe. I've been to Japan. I've been to North Korea. I've been to Canada. I've been to South America. I've been to Africa, just briefly. I've been to Europe. No place has the safest, most wholesome source of meat and food in general as the United States. No place. We must fight for private property rights and the ability to pass on our farms and ranches to the next generation. In order for us to have liberty, we must fight for it. Now, again, I'm not speaking here of violence. I hope it doesn't come to that. I assume we'd be willing to stand up should it. We should not have to do that in a true constitutional republic. Our founding fathers have established a mechanism where we can fight for what we want, fight for our freedom, fight for our liberty without having to take up arms like they had to do against the King of England. Our government should not be in the same position as King George was for our many states. The other that the Constitution has established for us as the federal government operates only if the states allow it. And there may come a time that the states have to stand up for states' rights. The federal government is too big. It's too far-reaching. It makes King George look like a fairy. We've got to stand up, and we've got to fight. We've got to vote. We've got to be activists. We cannot be pacifists. You know, God was not a pacifist. I've said from this very lectern in the past, if you think he was, you go to where in the Word it shows that King David took a census in order to brag to himself and all the nations around about how many men of war he had, how big an army he had. That very night, God sent an avenging angel across the nation of Israel, and 70,000 of those mighty men died in their sleep. So much for your census, King David. God is not a pacifist. And He does not intend for us to be a pacifist. He intends for us to be an activist. Is R-CALF an activist? You better believe it. You know, there is a price to pay for being an activist. The Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:6. All those who seek to live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. You know, I know that there are people in this room that have been abused, that have been attacked, that have suffered because of their stance for freedom and liberty. One of our delegation here from the state of Missouri told me yesterday that once they found out that they were in support of R-CALF and its policies, he lost the lease on 700 acres. All those who seek to live righteously in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. It is an established fact. Are you willing? Are you able? Will you fight? Does liberty mean something to you? I pray that it does. I pray that it does. I'm done, George.